be as professional as we can. So, all right. So main goal, yeah, for this meeting is continue to educate everybody on the NAR compliance changes. That's going to be brief. It's just the basics. Even though there's 182-page document that anybody can read, feel free to go through it. The primary changes we'll just talk about briefly. Then we're going to we're going to discuss and review the new forms that we're going to be using, some of which we've already talked about, you've been talking about for weeks. We have tweaked a couple of them, and I want to make sure that y'all are aware of that, and we'll show some specifics on it. And then last but not least, we've got one or two scenarios that we'll go through and kind of implement the forms and how you're actually going to be, presenting them and using them in day-to-day business. The ultimate goal here is to get you guys more confident in what you're doing day to day in your business. Embrace these changes, understand that, we can all complain or get aggravated that they exist, but the reality is, that's outside of our control. So we're going to take it and, understand the rules best we can and make sure that we can still do business. The last thing that we're going to do is roll over and say, well, all these changes are occurring and, it's just going to make it more difficult for me to do business. That's just not an option for us. It's not what we do. We're just going to, take the changes, make the best of them and, push ahead and, be better than the rest. So with that, the primary reason to do all this is so that you don't end up in a scenario like this particular guy on this video. And when I say video, that's, yep. Not hearing it, but all right. Well, that didn't work. I'm sure all of you are laughing inside, but it was basically just a video that said something like, hey, you get $500,000 and you're only paying me 30,000. And that was the listing agent. And then the other person says, at the 30,000, I'm only getting 1,000. That was the title agent. And then the little kid at the end goes, y'all are getting paid. And that was the buyer's agent. So don't be that buyer's agent. All right, moving along, recap. So just talking through the, all right, I'm getting some feedback again. If everybody just double check, make sure that you're on mute on your mic. Just it creates feedback. So recap again on the NAR changes. And again, I think everybody's pretty well aware of this, but MLSs will have to eliminate the broker compensation field. All that by August 17th. They are also prohibited from using MLS data or data feeds to directly or indirectly establish and maintain platforms of offers and compensation forms from multiple brokers or other buyer representatives. Such use must result in the MLS terminating participants' acceptance in MLS data and data fields. One thing to note, this is for like third-party companies that wanted to basically just aggregate all the same data again. The lawsuit settlement is to prohibit that. As a reminder, on the Bellator Go Bellator website, we will be showing offers of buyer broker compensation and seller concessions on the Go Bellator website. We can do that, and we can do that from the individual data entry that we'll be doing on our site, but we could not add other brokers' offers of compensation. So this will only be on Bellator's offers of compensation. And just so all of you know, your admin were at last Wednesday. We're here at the home office, and they learned how to do this data entry so that we could continue to do this and offer that as a convenience and another way for the sellers to be able to showcase that they are offering compensation to buyer brokers. And then the the other big one that, again, we've been talking about for quite a while is just that the MLS participants working with any buyer will have to go into a written agreement with the buyer prior to touring the first home. So, all right, next slide. So here are the new forms, and I want to take a second to go through these. Some of this has been some recent changes, but just I think we'll take some time, and I'm going to have individual slides on each of these. But the new AAR exclusive listing right to sell listing agreement is what the entire company will be using as our new listing agreement. And I'll go into the details. The new AAR compensation agreement between brokers is compensation agreement between all Alabama brokers is the you've seen this. This is the form that we're going to fill out to basically. Somebody's mic's on. If you'll turn that off, please. It's just giving feedback. Thank you. The AAR compensation agreement is what y'all have seen already, and that's basically the offers of buyer broker compensation that we're going to be offering to any other brokers. Then the BR purchase agreement and the residential and lots and land will be the new purchase agreement that we're utilizing, and we're going to go into the section that's changed. One thing to note, that is limited to only BR members. So for anybody that's not a member of Baldwin Realtors Association, that BR purchase agreement for lots and land and residential would not be available to you for you to use. But I know in all Mobile Area Association of Realtors, all of their forms, they're utilizing all the state forms, and they would be utilizing the state purchase agreement, state board's purchase agreement, both residential and lots and land. And then, and if anyone that's a member of BR would like to use the state form purchase agreement, you're more than welcome to do that. That's perfectly fine. For the last but not least, what you've seen is the buyer broker compensation agreement that includes that consultation agreement all in one document. We're going to show you that and the changes that we have recently made to hopefully make this a little easier for you to utilize in some of the scenarios that we come into play day to day. All right, next slide, please. And all of these documents will be in dotloop and Square One. Some of them are already there. Most of them are already there, but you'll be able to do that. Let me show you the dotloop. You'll have a new folder that will say New Docs 2024, and we're also setting up the new templates. The problem with dotloop is we have to send those documents to dotloop, and then we're kind of at their mercy of when they would actually be able to upload those. But we will have everything by this Friday, the latest versions of everything in Square One in Agent Docs. If you'll go to the next slide, you can see we've created another basically another folder. When you go into Square One, you'll see this top folder now. We took it out of the second line. Yeah. So it's going to be the very top thing when you see Agent Docs. When you get there, the second folder in is 2024 new form, I can't see it. New docs, new forms. And then once you get into the new docs and training, you'll see they're all of those are in there. There's 12 documents, and there's going to be a couple more added, but they're all there in Square One. So if you need to reference any of this, start there, and we'll have updates on when, it's obviously more convenient when you're writing a purchase agreement, everything, to have it in dotloop. The only thing that won't be updated is actually we would. Anyway, I won't even go there. Dotloop should have some most of what we need in the last few forms, probably within the next week, 10 days. All right, but you've got everything in Agent Docs. So one thing I feel like is probably very important that we need to discuss and make sure that you've got a good grip, grasp of to understand is what three forms of compensation, what are the three origins of compensation that we get as buyer brokers. One is obviously number one, go to the next slide if you would. There's three forms. Number one is if you are getting paid directly from the buyer, you get a buyer's compensation agreement and the buyer pays you direct. That one's pretty straightforward and easy. I don't think anybody's got any questions about that. You got a buyer's agency agreement with them with compensation. They pay you direct. So that's one. Number two, next slide. That is what most of us now are probably the most familiar with and see the most, and it is and I want to make sure everybody is with the same understanding. When you list a property and you go get a listing agreement, and let's just utilize for this scenario a 6% listing agreement that you obtain. When you get that listing agreement, you are within that, our current listing agreement, Bellator listing agreement, we have two blanks. One says we are going to retain X percent. In this scenario, we're going to say we're going to retain 3% of that listing side of the total 6% commission. We're going to retain that for the listing, the duties that we have performed for the listing. And then we are getting authorization from that seller to say, Mr. Seller, we're going to offer an addition that the other half of the commission, the other 3%, we're going to offer that to the buyer broker. So instantaneously at a closing, our contract that we have with that seller that says we're going to list the property for a total of 6%, we take that 6%, total 6% in possession, and then instantaneously we basically pay the buyer broker 3%. So that when you're looking at a settlement statement, you see total commission, then listing broker, 3%, Bellator, let's just say ABC Realty, buyer broker, they're 3%. So again, understanding that the way that money moves through is 6% origin of the listing agreement. All six goes to the listing broker, and then listing broker pays the buyer broker 3%. Might seem simple now, but I think some people just maybe are completely aware of how that works. So, all right. So the next and probably what we're going to start seeing more of, which is option three, which is when a seller, when you go to list the property, does not agree to pay a cooperating brokerage split. So they're going to say, what are the cost of your services for listing my property and listing my property only? If they are not willing to pay a cooperating within the listing agreement to authorize us to pay any type of compensation to the buyer broker, we'll be just retaining a 3% listing. Okay, that can happen. We'll obviously be continuing to do all the stuff that we've been talking about, showing the sellers the benefits of how that works and the benefits of being able to offer buyer broker compensation. But it's certainly always an option for them and they don't have to do it. So if that were the case, the other scenario is the seller can offer a buyer broker can pay buyer broker through the seller concessions that is negotiated within the purchase agreement. Okay, so understanding this is going to become probably more prevalent than you've ever seen it before. Make sure that you realize all that goes with that and understand that this is going to be something that's negotiated in your actual purchase agreement, and sellers will be offering, some will be offering offers of compensation, offers of concession to the sellers that might be 1%, 5%, 2%, $10,000, 1,000, 50,000, whatever their offering is. That's something that you're going to have to remember within the negotiations between you and your buyer, and you're representing them, that a portion of that only determined by the buyer would be included in paying your buyer broker fee. Okay. I know that seems somewhat complicated, but it's basically to the seller, the net proceeds would be the same, but how that money gets transferred, it is not going through the listing broker. It's coming directly, being paid through seller concessions. A portion of those seller concessions, or maybe all of those seller concessions, then paid for the buyer. So buyer would then elect to pay you as their buyer broker. We're going to get into this a little bit more in detail, but just wanted to kind of show you the overview of methods of payment. All right, next slide, please. All right, so first form, the new listing agreement that is AAR's listing agreement, and all Bellator agents will be using this. So there's again, the only uniqueness is the BR purchase agreement for BR members, Baldwin Realtor members. All right, next slide. So this is what the top of that listing agreement looks like from AAR. If you're not familiar with it, you can go to our current listing agreement, or Square One, and pull up this copy of the listing agreement. I want to make sure, though, that you're aware, if you go directly to AAR, you're going to get basically this same agreement, but there's going to be something missing, something that we have added. And this is what's the copy is already in Square One. You don't have to make any changes to this. In Square One, what a mercy. In Square One, the additional provisions, number 22, this is within the AAR listing agreement, additional provisions will have basically an A and a B that we have added. One is to address any buyer that comes directly to, because within the context of the listing agreement, it doesn't directly identify this, but if a buyer were to come directly to the listing agent, we're just reconfirming with the seller that there will be compensation for you. That may be in addition to if you had a seller that said that they're not going to offer any type of concessions for buyer brokers. This is where you would put in there that your fee would be X, whatever that fee would be. Let's just say it's 3% if you served as a transaction broker or in a limited consensual dual with their approval. Capacity to serve that buyer and facilitate the transaction. That is not in the standard AAR listing agreement. And then number B was just a simple provision for some reason they don't have, which is basically the seller giving us consent to utilize the photography and everything of their property. So if you'll go to the next slide. So within the listing agreement, I want to make sure we identify, because recently we've had I think a few people have gone through this, and I'll be the first to admit it is a little confusing until you get used to it. So I wanted to show you on number 4, this is still within the AAR listing agreement. You're going to see pretty standard language, seller concessions. Seller broker compensation. Seller agrees to pay broker blank dollars or blank percent. You check the box, write in the percentage, just like you normally would. Here is where you're going to almost have to go down and make sure that they understand the next section, which is the optional compensation. So you're going to fill in this portion, but talk to the seller about the optional broker compensation. If you'll go to the next slide, it'll show 5. So this is where it can get a little bit confusing, because remember, we are getting a total compensation, a listing, and I'm going to say if in the scenario where a seller is in agreement to offer buyer broker compensation, then you're going to have your total commission at the top. Same scenario as last time, 6%. Then you're going to come down to number 5, and it is showing that the broker optional buyer broker compensation. Lord of mercy, I keep getting people. Um, whoever just logged in, if you can, oh, thank you. So the optional buyer broker compensation, you know, first, the disclosure, it is not required. So all sellers need to be aware this is not required. It's an option. But if they so choose, after you've discussed the benefits of doing this and um, why they feel, you know, or the benefits that you've explained to them that are that come along with offering buyer broker compensation, then you would check. And actually, if you'll go to the next slide, I've got it. Yeah. So if you are checking um, number in B, you're going to check buyer is authorizing, and then I, payment will be made by seller's broker out of the compensation due to seller's broker under the paragraph 4. So in paragraph 4, we have 6%. Of that 6%, we're saying that a portion of that we're going to share with another broker, just like we normally have been. And then under that, we're going to yeah, offer them. Wait a minute. Yeah, yeah. So in doing so, I was thinking, oh my gosh. And then under C, you're going to identify. In B, they're saying yes, we're going to authorize the us as the listing broker to authorize us to share compensation with the buyer broker. And then in C, it's going to identify how much. So we're going to, and this is kind of a new one. I've never, you know, this is the first time I've ever seen this, but they're in the state form, they're giving us an option to share compensation with all brokers equally. So in our previous scenario, we're going to have a total listing of 6%, and then seller is going to authorize Bellator to share in this scenario, if they agree, 3% with the buyer broker agent. So you'd have the first check, the I checked, and then in C, you would also have the single I checked, and then the dollar amount or percentage amount that they agreed to share. And that's all you have to have. Okay. In the second scenario, you could have that same two top boxes in I, but underneath a a new option has come available, which is basically allowing you, or I'm sorry, allowing the seller to determine if they want to offer different compensation if the buyer broker is either representing the buyer in agency or representing or serving as a transaction broker. That's new. We can talk more in detail, but it's just a new option. I don't. I feel like that gets you a slippery slope, but we can debate that or talk about that more later. Um, so that's the scenario. Here's what's key. If you notice in B, if you pick I, your only two options would either be in C would be I or II. Those are the two. The triple I is not, and I'll explain in a minute. But this is kind of confusing, and I want to make sure that everybody is under the same interpretation. So when you pick the first one, which is going to be almost in most cases, as we've been doing business in the past, this would be your most logical is picking BI and CI. Okay. But II is an option if they wanted to make a difference between a buyer representative being an agent or a transaction broker. Okay. Next slide, please. So in the second scenario and in the listing agreement, if a offer of compensation if that option, if they wanted to make it on a case by case basis, they can do that. And so if you're in B, if you're picking the second box, which is II, then the only option that you would pick is option III and C, which is basically saying, all right, we don't know what the compensation is going to be yet. I will offer it. We're going to have to sign a separate agreement, which would be basically the purchase agreement. And we would offer that in a separate agreement through on a case by case basis. Again, very complicated. I don't know why that they've decided to offer this or go down this road, but it's certainly something that's obviously tied into the lawsuit and something that we have to provide to the sellers as an option to them. But this form, until you kind of get used to it, can be a little confusing. So I just wanted to I guess reiterate that if you're picking the second box in number 5B, if you pick the second box II, the only option really is the triple I in the bottom. And we'll be able to share this, and you can come back and reference it. But wanted to show you that on today's meeting. All right, next slide. So weird just talking by yourself. All right. The other is the very next section below this. I didn't put anything in there because I think it's pretty straightforward, but the optional seller concessions. So as a seller, they could do one of two things. They could offer seller concessions, even if they've already authorized Bellator to offer buyer broker commission compensation. They may want additional concessions offered to the buyer. Maybe they feel like, hey, their roof might need to be replaced, and so they want to offer more concessions to the buyer broker. I'm sorry, to the buyer. That's seller concessions. They can do that. You would just come down here, click on seller, second box, authorizes seller concessions offer. If applicable and known, the listing concessions amount. So this is like if they already knew, hey, it's going to cost $15,000 to put on a new roof. I want to offer $15,000 in seller concessions for the buyer. One thing to note is that when they offer seller concessions, whether that's with buyer broker compensation or without, doesn't matter, that those concessions are then basically negotiated between seller and buyer has full liberty to decide how those concessions are what they're paid towards. So just keep in mind, just because you get in negotiating in a contract, just because there is, let's just say that there is no offers of compensation that the seller's offered, but they are offering, broker compensations, but they are offering concessions to the seller, by the seller to the buyer. And that may also be 3%. You're going to have it negotiated through your buyer broker agreement that those concessions are being paid to you. That 3% is they're obligated to pay that. If you don't have that agreement, then you have no way to hold them to that. So it's just another little factor and one little nuance that we got to make sure that if that's the scenario that you're making sure you've got the contracts you need and the agreements you need to make sure that you're getting paid. All right, next slide. The other is just I wanted to make sure if you notice.
Troy?
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, before we move on, so let me can I ask a clarifying question about seller concessions?
Sure.
So I'm wondering about, it states in the document that sellers can't tell a buyer what to use the concessions for, though there is a box in there that says that part of the concession will be used towards buyer agency compensation. Am I reading that correctly?
Yeah, and if you'll go back one slide, Amanda. That's the same one. There you go. So ask your question again.
So it states somewhere in this purchase agreement, and I can't see the whole document right now.
Well,
this is the listing agreement.
Yeah, remember, we're
listing
just talking the listing agreement here. We're just talking about what the seller is saying. Hey, I'm offering a concession. You're correct. On the
Yes,
buyer
on the
side, it cannot
purchase-
be.
yeah.
Yeah, and the
Okay.
purchase agreement and the buyer side, absolutely, it can't be dictated what those concessions are used for.
Yeah.
But this is just on the listing side. So
Just
if we're
on the
just working with the
listing
seller, we don't really need to know any of that right now.
Yeah,
It would come into play, obviously, if we were on both sides.
yeah. So when
So-
we get to that, I wanted to kind of make that point that
Absolutely.
here
That's going
it
to be
says
a
that-
very,
yeah.
very key
Right.
point when we
but
get
it's
to the
different on the purchase agreement.
Yeah.
All right.
Perfect. Thank y'all.
All right, if you'll click the next slide. So just to note, if you look under another number 11, that the MLS disclaimer, the seller, again, we're on the listing agreement still. I know it doesn't have the top or showing you, but we're still in the Alabama Association of Realtors most updated listing agreement. And in there, you just need to identify that the seller is giving permission that you're going to abide by the association rules or MLS rules. And you're going to write in. So if you're a member of Mobile Association of Realtors, you're a member of Baldwin Association of Realtors, and you're a member of Pensacola, and you're going to put it in all three, you'd put all three of those on that line. And then they're initialing, because you theoretically could have three different rules about offers of compensation and offers of concessions to the seller. And the way that is basically promoted through those or displayed through those MLSs could be different, and they have to know that. So it's just something to note on there. You want to just make sure you write in the names of each of the MLSs that you're a member of and plan to utilize for their listing. So the other is just number 12, just to understand that in the listing agreement, there is a box here for the seller to go ahead and consent to dual agency, and it explains that, but also know you're still going to need to get a separate limited consensual dual agency agreement signed in addition to the listing agreement. So, all right, next slide, please. So next form that we're going to use is the compensation agreement between Alabama brokers. This will be quick. Y'all have all been using it. I just wanted to show it to you. Next slide. That's the form. I just pulled one up that's already filled out. Again, I would suggest that for all of your listings, with the caveat that assuming you have an offer of compensation to the sellers, to the listing agents, that you've got that you have in your current listing agreements an offer of compensation to other buyer brokers. Just vast majority, if not every single one, already have that. You want to have this prepared and ready with the listing information. So basically, Bellator at the top, we're going to have the property address of your listing, then the amount of compensation, and then your specific information. I probably have a copy of it on your phone that you could text it to an agent, or obviously in your email. Just have it ready so that you can do this. These forms cannot be on MLS. To my knowledge, as of right now, you can't have this like as other docs on MLS or Showing Time. I know that's come up. So as of right now, we have to basically take that information and disseminate it individually to these listing or agents that are going to be showing property. This will just be a quick and efficient way to do that, so that you're not having to try to do it every time or go back and try to do it if you don't have it already put together. Remember, you don't necessarily need it back from them. If they want to complete it, sign it, and send it back, that's good. But you're sending it as if basically it's insurance for them that they're going to get paid on this particular property for the compensation that's agreed to. One thing to remember too, when you're going to show property, you want to at least request this from all the the agents that you're showing property in. But keep in mind, there are going to be, especially as time goes on, I feel you will see some companies, and some companies have already made statements. EXP, Keller Williams, and another franchise have all made the statement that they are no longer going to be offering compensation, broker-to-broker compensation. So those companies wouldn't even have these forms. So they are removing that ability for the seller to be able to offer compensation directly from the listing broker. So in that case, there would not be one of those. Your compensation then is basically the combination of the purchase agreement and what's negotiated in it, and then ultimately your buyer broker compensation agreement with your buyer. All right, next slide, please.
Troy, I do want to point out, obviously, we don't know what other companies are going to do. There is the chance that, there might be some Keller Williams agents. I know that I've heard that blanket statement. They're not offering any compensation. That does not mean that their sellers aren't or can't offer seller concessions to the buyer. So just seeing brokerages that aren't offering broker to broker compensation does not mean there's not compensation offered through seller concessions. So we're going to have to see how other companies react to that, or change. But don't get it in your head immediately that, oh, it's Keller Williams. There's no way they're going to be able to pay broker to broker compensation. So
Well,
that made
they,
things any clearer. It probably didn't.
well, I mean, but they can't. They cannot pay broker to broker compensation. Concessions can come from the seller, and
Right.
it can be obligated by the buyer to pay a portion or all of their agreement with the buyer broker, but it's not going to come through the listing broker anymore. So, and this is my point. It specifically states that the seller is going to offer concessions. Those concessions are then basically negotiated on the purchase agreement, and the buyer now has, within those funds that the sellers agreed to pay within the purchase price, they take control and say this much is going to be allotted for paying, repairs, or I'm going to pay some closing costs with it, whatever. That's where making sure that we've got an agreement with that buyer that's obligations of whatever your buyer broker fee is, that will cover it within the purchase agreement, because it's not a guarantee of compensation. I just want to make sure that everybody understands that until you have those two agreements signed. Okay. So make sure that, you keep that in mind. The way we're doing it now, basically, that's one agreement that we've agreed to within the purchase price, and the sellers are to agree to it. As we go into some of the undefined or unknown offers of compensation, until it's agreed upon in the purchase agreement, that's where you're really going to have to start paying attention. We're going to have multiple more discussions about this. I'm sure every single one of you will probably come up with a new scenario that maybe we haven't even thought of yet, but don't worry, we're here. We're going to talk about it. And as you get these, you'll be able to, we'll be able to see more and more. And I don't expect there to be a ton of them right away, but there could be. But the expectation is, as time goes on, we may be subject to more of these. So we just need to be aware. That's why we're trying to educate you about it, because I don't want you showing up to a closing and there not being compensation for you. All right. Click ahead. Did I miss? Is there? Oh, yeah, this is the follow-up. I mean, this is pretty much what we just talked about. Only having a listing agreement, yeah, we've already talked about that. And as a buyer's agent, be prepared to know that you're not gonna be getting a broker-to-broker compensation agreement from every broker. Some just may not have. They may have just been too lazy and hadn't done it. If there is a offer of compensation, then fill one out for them and send it to them, so that you get them to sign it and get it back, if you're showing property that they have listed. And then again, there will just be some that say, the seller hasn't authorized us to share any compensation. So that's where you're gonna have to negotiate it in the purchase price, within the purchase agreement. All right, next slide, please. Yeah, I don't know if it's worth doing or not, but the sound come on.
Lock it up. You better lock it up. No, you lock it up. You lock it up. Lock it up. Lock it up.
This will be the discussion terms between the listing agent and buyer agent on making sure that concessions get agreed to within a purchase agreement. All right, little humor. It's really odd when you're just sitting here in a silent room talking to yourself. All right, I got somebody laughing. All right, number 3, purchase agreement. This is the Baldwin County, Baldwin Realtors purchase agreement for residential lots and land. I'm just going to show you one section in here, which is the change. If you'll click to it. So basically in number 4, buyer seller costs, Most of that same information was there before, but the second page, seller paid compensation, this is specifically where that compensation for buyers, the buyer broker is going to need to be in there, and that they're giving, both parties, both seller and buyer, are agreeing to pay that percentage to the buyer broker. All right, up a little bit. It's the percentage blank. Yep, right there. Yep. So there, that's where you want to make sure that box is checked and that there's an agreement. Assuming that the buyer is expecting the seller to pay all of it within the seller concessions, you would want to make sure that the amount that you've got in your buyer agency agreement, compensation agreement, that agreement with your buyer matches the amount in the purchase price, if it's not coming from concessions or broker to broker compensation. All right, next slide. So this is the new AAR residential purchase agreement. Like there, same basic principle. It's just, the broker compensation is going to be here, and making sure that those are paid in agreement to whatever's either being offered through seller concessions or through the compensation agreement that's being offered by the listing brokerage. All right, I think that's pretty straightforward. All right, new Bellator forms. This is the buyer broker compensation. So if y'all remember, we rolled this out a couple of months ago, and really starting more with the buyer broker consultation, which is where we really tried to help you really get better prepared to articulate your value proposition. Next slide, if you will. That agreement, so in one PDF we have had, first thing was ReCAD. No changes there. The next thing was the buyer consultation, which was all the reasons why a buyer benefits from utilizing your services as a buyer broker. The next was the buyer broker services agreement, which is saying, okay, these are the services that we provide, and we will serve you in an agency capacity, exclusive agent capacity, and these are the services that we perform for you. They would sign it, and then part of that agreement is the buyer broker compensation. This is all in one PDF. Everything pretty much has stayed the same. We did make some tweaks, basically took out the repetition of Bellator on the titles, and we had a couple of typos, but this is the big change, and I want to make sure that everybody was aware of it. I'll make this statement now. I have not gotten this approved by our attorney yet. I hope to have that done hopefully by the end of today, at the worst case tomorrow morning. Once that's done, we'll announce it and send it out. But right now, the old version is still sitting in square one. But here's the difference, and this is, and it'll kind of come to us in the next little scenario, but we wanted to differentiate between resale brokerage. So basically offering, when we were a difference in compensation, one would be showing existing properties, and that might be where we tweak the name of this through the seller concessions being offered. We would get, that's one of the changes that we made within this, and that we would get paid in your traditional resale, properties. One of the questions that's come up multiple times is, what if there's a difference in showing new construction? New construction sometimes, especially in pre-sales, and there's a lot more involved. Some people are taking and representing buyers that may started looking at properties, and they were looking at existing homes, and then they just said, you know what, we can't find what we like. We're just going to, we want to buy a lot, and we want to get you to help us build a home. Well, that's a whole new avenue. I mean, that's a whole new skill set for you as an agent representing the buyer, and a ton of extra work, tons of extra work. So what we wanted to do, and I haven't seen this in other buyer broker compensation agreements, but it was discussed at one of the Q&As that the state put on, that we could have a difference between our services agreements, the services we provided, and our compensation. So I've elected to put this in, which is basically a separate section. You could show them new construction. I'm sorry, existing homes. We're going to have compensation for that. That would be A. Different compensation if they decide to start looking at, whether it's D.R. Horton, whether it's, a custom builder, whether it's, or buying a lot and selling it. If it's new construction, it typically takes on a whole new caveat, and you could negotiate a different compensation fee for that. It might be the same. And then we also put in other provisions because there are times where you might want to put some kind of caveat. And specifically, if someone's maybe having heartburn with, it's the first time I've met you, I don't know if I'm going to like you or not, and I'm not willing to commit to just being, you being a buyer's agent for any and all purchases that we make. But I will do it for this one property. Well, this is where we would put that one property and make that concession for that one property that we would show. It will tie to the other part as well, but this is where we would actually address the compensation aspect of it. So you've got that in other provisions, or you've got a space in other provisions to make that sort of hopefully rare occurrence, but we feel like there's probably going to be opportunity that you would need to use that. So it is now in there. I will say it is not approved yet. So hopefully I'll get that today or the latest tomorrow morning. And then when so, we'll send it out. And again, I don't want to, I know some of this is new and you're like, oh my gosh, I don't understand that. I'll be here for as long as we need to answer questions today. And then we're going to have plenty more of these sessions and in your individual offices time to make sure that we're all comfortable with these. So, all right, next slide. Keep going. How do we use all this stuff? So here's one quick scenario that I felt like would probably be the most questioned, and that is, hey, I've got a buyer walks into the office and they just said that they want to, you talk to them, they want to purchase a home, they'd like buyer broker services. You go through it, they sign a compensation agreement and a buyer's agency agreement with you. You agree to a 2.5% buyer broker concessions. Compensation, I'm sorry, buyer broker compensation of 2.5%. You go view homes, they write, they find a home they love, and come to find out there is a buyer broker compensation being paid at 3%. The question is, you've got a compensation agreement with them at 2.5. In this scenario, they're saying the seller is paying 3%. What can we do? Can I change it? Can I go back and just change the form and get the buyer to agree to it? If you'll go to the next slide. So we sent this to AAR, and this was their response to that question. They said, one, it's a very common question. They're referring to NAR at first. The NAR rules allow you to amend your contract with the buyer's permission and the agreement, but Bellator is recommending against it for a few reasons. I don't know how Bellator got in there. Bellator shouldn't be in there. Sorry, I just missed that.
Yeah, this is guidance. This is guidance from the state, which Bellator plans to follow. So I guess we're recommending it, but it's on the recommendation of the state's attorneys.
Well, I think we've got a little bit of differentiation, but the recommendation from AAR, and it's because you can't address every scenario in a simple statement. So, but we'll talk about it, and it's what we just addressed in the having a two different offerings of services. In a nutshell, what they're saying is you can't just perform one level of services and have an agreement with a buyer to offer it, let's just say in this scenario, at 2.5%. And then all of a sudden in that scenario, it just, there's an offering of 3%, but you've already agreed to it. Unless there is some additional services that you're going to provide in the course of normal, duties, to basically to earn that, because ultimately what we're here to do is to have the buyer's best interest at heart and making sure that, that's not compromised. So it totally makes sense. And I totally agree. The one caveat would be, and AAR's recommendation is that you would just stick with the 2.5% and you not just go and randomly say, hey, This one's 3%. Would y'all just let me get the 3%, and go back to them and try to renegotiate that simply just to get paid more money? That's where a problem's going to occur, and that's where a lot of liability would come into play. And quite honestly, it's the basis for, what a lot of the attorneys were talking about in the, inconsistencies with some of the compensation being paid by the listing brokerages, but also by the buyer agencies or buyer brokers. So in that compensation, or in that recommendation, I have one caveat, which if we can go to the next slide. So never mind. I'm sorry, I did take it out. But if we go back to that previous slide, if you don't mind 1 second, because I want to hit it. I know I'm already 10 minutes past time, but this is the second to last slide. In that scenario, what you've got to remember is, can you change the commission? You can change it. And in my scenario, I used new construction, showing properties, existing homes that are completed and, doing our traditional job. We know that. But if you're going to get into new construction, whether it's, large builder, small builder, there are more times than not a much longer process. If the home's under construction, it might take 6, 9, 10, 12 months for that entire process. So you may want to renegotiate because the services are different and the expertise of what you've got to bring to the table is different. There can be a different compensation within the initial compensation agreement that you agree to with that buyer. It does not have to be the same if you've got different services. But in the scenario that we just talked about, if you're just providing same level of services and you want to go up on your fee just because a seller has maybe offered higher compensation, that's not something you can do. One of the scenarios they suggest is if the offering of compensation is there, you negotiate maybe the purchase price down, or in that case where it was offering 3% and your agreement with your buyer is at 2.5%, take that extra 0.5% and maybe try to negotiate that into the buyer getting additional closing costs paid for, or some other benefit that goes back to the buyer itself. All right. Last one. I think this is the last slide. Next one. And this is just to remember offerings of compensation. We've got 2 different MLSs that we deal with primarily, and just wanted everybody to know, because at one point we thought Baldwin Realtors would be actually just have a box that would have a check bar, yes or no, if the seller is offering seller concessions. They have decided not to do that, but Mobile Association of Realtors is offering that, and there will be a yes box to check if the seller is offering seller concessions. Baldwin Realtors has decided to allow offerings of seller concessions both in public remarks and agent remarks, but those remarks will have to be limited, something like, the seller is offering, up to $15,000 in seller concessions, but there can't be any other specifics, or Wendy gave a specific example. They can put the details they would like in the concessions, except for details regarding commissions, compensations, or bonuses. For example, if the seller wants to give a flat amount, $15,000, to allow the buyer to choose how the money is spent, a good sentence would be, seller's offering $15,000 in concessions to buyer. This way the buyer can take a portion of that money and pay the buyer broker and whatever else is needed. So again, this is where I go back to when the seller is paying seller concessions and it's one lump sum, there may be 4% that's being paid in, but if your buyer broker agreement is for 2.5%, you would only be allowed to take 2.5% of that 4% being offered by the seller in buyer broker compensations, and that is still limited to the buyer obligating those funds to you in your agreement. What does it say? Also, seller will entertain all buyer concessions in public remarks. So those are 2 things for BR members. that you would be. So I know it's a little confusing. Mobile, check a box. They either offering it or they're not. In Baldwin Realtors, no box because you can't sort by the box, is I think some of the reasonings why. But in seller concessions, in other remarks, public remarks and in agent remarks, you can make these comments so that it is known that there are, concessions available based on the current purchase price. All right, I think it's the last slide, and I'm right at an hour. All right.
Blinded by the light, wrapped up like a douche, another runner in the night. Blinded by the
Don't
light,
be one of these
wrapped
agents.
up like a douche, another runner in the night.
Unfortunately, we're going to have a lot of folks running around, showing properties, writing offers, and they're going to be blind as they can be. Here's what I'll say, and I think Annette said it the other day on the broker call. Be compassionate, be kind. Unfortunately, not everybody's going to spend the time, effort, and energy to be on top of their game like we are. And for the next couple of months, probably even a year or better, we're going to have to just be compassionate in how we're working with our fellow brokers and give them guidance into where we're going. Not so much as we still have to represent our buyers or sellers, depending on which side we're on. But just be patient and be kind, because I promise you it's going to be frustrating. And some of this, to be quite honest, we're all going to be learning together. And one other little caveat, I'm quite sure there's probably going to be some additional changes at some point. Hopefully not a lot, but there probably will be. So with that, I'll shut up. 11:01. And I think we did a pretty good job getting through everything. And now I will open it up to questions. I know some of you have already had a sales meeting, and now you're getting to, either A, if your broker's wanting to take some time to go one-on-one with you, that's great. If you want to stay on, we can open it up, and I'll be glad to answer as many questions as you've got time to ask. So where do we want to start? Have we got things on the
Yeah, Troy, Hans got a question, and it'll open up some pretty good debate. Probably some.
Can I start with an
philosophy.
easy one, damn it?
No, she's playing lawyer, and she's carving up our listing agreement. But she's bringing up a good question, and I think it's what a lot of people are thinking in their mind. So in the listing agreement, she was asking, can we strike out a certain paragraph? I don't agree discussing seller's concessions until it is asked in an offer from the buyer. So in other words,
hold on a
not
second.
wanting to have that conversation, but go ahead with what
Let's
you were
go
gonna
to
say.
this. Can we go to the, this is in the AAR listing agreement, correct?
Correct. This is the AAR listing agreement where we're discussing seller concessions. So Amanda will have to drive back to.
All right. So ask the question one more time on.
Okay. Get Amanda to the right place.
Yep.
This is compensation agreement. This is going to be in the listing agreement, the exclusive right
that was
to
it.
sell.
Go
Yeah,
back
right
one.
here. One.
Yeah, right there.
Okay. Now
back one
go.
more.
We're going to want to be on the part that is talking about that she needs to go down one more.
Right there. Whoa,
and
stop.
And then the part that is, we're going to go down wherever we've got in there, I think is one more click down where it talks about seller concessions. Optional seller concessions. I think she's probably talking about paragraph 6. So she's asking, can we strike out this certain paragraph? I don't agree discussing seller's concessions until it is asked in an offer from a buyer.
And you just click does not authorize.
Well, she's saying, and Han, you might want to, you can feel free to unmute if you can, or type in, maybe just not wanting to have that conversation. I'm not exactly sure the question, if it's just unsure about having that conversation in advance, or just not.
I don't think we have that option. And again, guys, this is the reason why, we've elected to go with the state forms. There's been a team of attorneys working for months to go through this. And what I don't want to do is, overlook or not have something in an agreement. And I understand what you're saying. I mean, you're not saying it would be removed, but to cross through it because, I mean, you've got to have the conversation with them to explain that it is a option for them. Option A would be compensation. Option B would, be through seller concessions. Any and all is optional. Honestly, for us, the only thing that's not optional is if you want us to list your property, we're going to, our professional service fee to be able to list your property is going to be X. So whatever that is, that's the only part that, for us is not an option, because that's the benefit of, capitalism and us being able to do business. Unless for some reason you're really in a great mood and you want to do it for free. I'm not a proponent of doing that. But here, these two things, under the basis of this, the changes from the settlement, you have to offer this to them. Now, explanation of it and getting them with a good understanding and understanding the market and the benefits that come from, one way versus the other, that's going to go back to, and what we've been talking about for, months, that's where you've got to come in and say, Mr. and Miss Seller, here are the benefits of option A, here are the benefits of option B, and here are the options of benefits or, lack of benefits in option C. But like striking through it, no, not something that we can do. Does
Can
that
I-
answer the? Go ahead.
Yeah, Troy. So this is about leverage for me. I'm going to have the conversation with my seller that they can't, let's say like I'm already getting cooperation compensation for the buyers, right? So for me, it's more about leverage. I don't want to have to check this box, whether that's on the MLS or, I mean, I'm happy to talk to my seller about this and have them signing this agreement, but in the seller concession paragraph, I just don't want that public knowledge of it because it comes back to being leverage of how much I can negotiate if I'm representing the seller to get the most amount of money for their property. That's what it comes down to. But if my seller's not going to provide compensation, again, it's still a negotiation point, right? So I guess I'm happy to do it on our thing. I just don't want to check that box on the MLS or put anything, frankly, in any remarks unless it has to do with that my seller's not offering compensation. If they are, I just don't want it to be public knowledge because, again, it's a leverage and a tool for me for negotiation.
I think you check does not, and then you wait and see if any buyer brings an offer that is asking for it. I mean, just because it doesn't indicate in MLS that you are paying it doesn't, you know what I'm saying? I think there's going to be a lot of requests for seller concessions, even if it says no, they're not offering seller concessions.
Well, let me just make this statement though, and Han, thank you for the question. And a couple of things you said is I'm not going to, and here's what I'm not going to do. One thing we have to remember in all of this is all we do is provide the information to the seller. Then we give them, understanding of it, explain it, and then we ask them the question and they give us direction on what they want to do. So it's up to them to decide, but you can certainly make your argument. Here's why I would probably, advise you to either do it or not do it based on the conversation and the scenario that you're dealing with on that listing. So hopefully that answered it. All right, let's get to another question if we can. I want to try to get through as many as possible. And Han, if that didn't and you want to talk more about it, I'll be glad to, we can circle back at the end too. And that's true of any of you. If we go through and it's still not, clear, we'll talk about it some more. All right.
All right. Here's Rick's asking I think he's saying, how is builder's bonus going to be handled? So D.R. Horton's offering a $8,000.
I don't know.
Bonus.
I mean, I'll just be quite frank. I don't know. I mean, only thing you're going to have to do is, I would expect they're probably going to go away with them, and it's probably just going to be an increase in, commission. But I don't know how you address it. Here's the deal. The limitations are, what does your buyer broker compensation agreement have? That's going to be your limitation. If there's an amount being offered that's higher than that, and there's not some way to come back and negotiate that you feel like if you're standing in front of a judge, you can prove to them that the reason you increased that compensation was because there was some type of increase in duties that you performed, or there was some benefit to the buyer by that being done. Maybe there was a portion of that being paid to, closing costs or whatever, and they agreed to it. But, I've been asked that 100 times. I'd say it's a case by case basis, but more than likely they're going to go away, and more than likely it's not something that you're going to be able to participate in. It's going to be a limitation. Again, that's the basis of this whole suit was, it's not a direct correlation between what the service is being provided by the buyer's broker, and the compensation that's being received. Hopefully
Annette, did you have some information that someone for D.R. Horton shared with you last week?
Yes, I did. He said that if bonuses go away, that what Horton is planning to do, at least in Mobile County, because that's who I was speaking to, is the manager for Mobile County. He said that they would just increase the amount of the commission compensation. So maybe they add 0.5% or 1% to the existing commission structure. And you would know that. You would have that conversation up front with your D.R. Horton agent. If you're sitting at an open house, or if you just kind of want to get in with them now, whoever your favorite person is that you work with over there, and ask them, just stay in the conversation with them so that your documents can all line up once you have a buyer that's going in that direction.
Yep. And back to our unofficially approved compensation agreement. That's why we have the new construction. So, you'd have one fee structure for your buyer agent services for resales, and then one for new construction. And there could even be in other provisions, maybe you've got one that's existing or nearly completed homes, and then for any types of pre-sales or build on your own lot, or custom builders, there would be a separate fee. But again, for right now, if you get into that scenario, feel free, let's talk through that, especially if you get into other provisions. But we're going to hopefully have that finalized, and you can utilize that form. And that's probably one of the reasons that I'm not using the state form, which is, not going to be, that's an agreement between the brokerage and the buyers themselves. So I don't feel like it's going to be out there on display. Shouldn't be. So anyway,
Well, if an agent wants to use the state's broker compensation form, or
absolutely. Let me just make this statement. If you want to use the state form, any state form that's on their website, you're more than welcome to use those. You're going to have a direct link on your .loop. When you are in .loop, you'll be able to log in. You will have to know your NERDS number, but you'll be able to go in and get all the state forms and utilize those. The one caveat is on the listing agreement. Remember, if you for some reason go directly to the state's form, and you're going to know, you've got to kind of, those that have done it, it's a couple extra steps, but you're not going to have the provisions on 22 that we've already got pre-printed. So just make sure, if you're using the listing agreement, make sure you're using the one that we'll have in the 2024 new forms. And that will be there'll be a separate file in folder in .loop, and then one in Square One. Okay.
And going to the state forms, obviously on the purchase agreement, the reason we're also using the Baldwin County purchase agreement because it addresses condominiums and single tax, which will not be found in the state. So that was the decision to use the BR form there.
Yeah. So if you're, writing purchase agreement for and for the condos, there's condo specific language in there about the HOA and stuff. There's just a lot of good language kind of specific to Baldwin County that I think is good to utilize. So,
all right, back in the questions, Monica and had Jeremy had something, Monica, you're going to have to chime in. I'm not sure I understand the TBD, so I'm going to move down to Michelle's question. Are concessions, allowances, compensations all encompassed in loan limits allowed? Are concessions, allowances, compensations all encompassed in loan limits allowed by the lender? Question mark. I'm asking Michelle if you want to chime in.
Yeah, Michelle.
Yeah, it's, the lender, like, there's max seller concessions on certain loans. Are those all encompassed, or can they be separated, or say,
Can what be separated?
because we're going to be negotiating sellers to pay allowance or compensations, concessions, or closing costs, all of that, and certain loans can't exceed a certain percentage. Is all of those going to be included? So we need to be mindful. We can't, if the seller needs X amount of dollars for closing costs, prepaid items, things like that, if that maxes them out per the loan,
Your
then,
SOL.
Yeah.
I mean, well, and what happens is then you have to explain to the buyer, you still, so it's what I was talking about before, and you're right. There are limitations, and I'm not even going to begin to tell you what they are, and because VA's got one, FHA's got another, but here's the thing, that would be something you'd need to make sure and discuss with your lender ahead of time, especially if you're expecting, to write an offer on a property that is not offering broker to broker compensation. Broker to broker compensation bypasses what Michelle is asking about. Okay. That is the broker paying the other broker, you, the buyer agent, buyer broker, compensation. That is not included in seller concessions that can be paid and loan limits, and it doesn't factor into it. So that's just another benefit of when we're talking to a seller and explaining the differences between it. It's one more, box to check or thing to make sure you explain. So when they do that and they offer that concession, yes, you're right. To my knowledge, now I do think that I read that VA is allowing it, and maybe even that it could be not a part of it, but we would really need to get a lender to be able to speak, because I don't know enough to tell you what is and isn't. But I would just say that if you're writing a purchase agreement on a property that is not offering broker to broker compensation, then you really, really need to make sure that you have identified in seller concessions how much of that the buyer is expecting to actually get in closing costs and other things outside of the buyer broker compensation. And if so, is there a limitation, and what that limitation is? And so let's just say the limitation is 6%, and they are paying, the seller is willing to pay 5%, and your compensation agreement is 3%. So that amount's coming in, but they need an additional 3%. Well, there's not enough concession being paid for you to get 3%, and there be 3% paid towards closing cost. So that's where you got to make sure that you've got it. And one thing I forgot to cover, that I meant to, and I didn't pull it up, but we're also going to be utilizing the state's new estimated closing costs, both for buyer and for seller, and it breaks those concessions out. So when you're writing your purchase agreement for your buyer, or you're working up a net sheet for your seller, you're gonna break those things out and show what they're coming from, so you'll know how it's being paid, and that will help you kind of disseminate or determine whether or not that you're going to have a shortfall. But I'm telling you, that's going to happen. So that's a good question.
All right, Jackie's got a question. I think this is probably the most important thing we're going to talk about as far as keeping ourselves out of trouble. You can list seller concessions in public and agent remarks, but not commission. Or is the seller concessions considered commission?
The seller concessions is not, I'll repeat, the seller concessions is not considered commissions. Completely different. If so, they would have just said seller offering commissions. So that is probably, to Jeff's point, if you get one thing today, understand there is a pool of money that if the seller is not offering the listing broker to offer buyer broker compensation or buyer broker commissions, let's call it for simplistic language. If that's not being offered, and the only way the buyer said, I've got no cash and I've got no way to pay you, we're going to have to negotiate it within the terms of this purchase agreement, then in that purchase agreement, you're going to negotiate seller concessions. In those seller concessions, you've got to get it in the purchase agreement that a portion of that will be hopefully, the exact amount that you're getting as compensation through your buyer broker agreement to cover that amount, 2.5%, 3%, 5%, 10%, whatever you've negotiated. But that's got to be included in those seller concessions. And I know it sounds like, well, you're saying the same thing. In essence, you are, but remember, the seller is just saying, I now have a pool of money that I am willing to pay the buyer, and the buyer is going to decide how that money is distributed. So you've got to make sure that within that purchase agreement, there's enough money to cover your fee, and to make sure that that agreement that you've got with your buyer dictates that that money is being paid to you or to the brokerage that is enough to cover whatever it is that that you've agreed upon. Let's just say 2.5%. So does that make sense?
And if you're on the listing side and your seller is offering seller concessions, all you can put in the MLS is that the seller is offering seller concessions. It can't dictate or try to outline in any way what those seller concessions can be used for, what the buyer could use that money for. That's up to the buyer to determine how they want to use that money. Hopefully that buyer is using some of that money to pay their buyer broker, but we can't dictate that unless it is written into the purchase agreement by the buyer and the seller. So,
and that's involved with realtors. At MAR, there's just a yes or no checkbox. You cannot put those words in either agent remarks or public remarks.
Sorry, I'm thinking Baldwin. Yes, in Mobile, you can only click the box, yes or no. In Baldwin, there is no box to click, but you can say sellers offering seller concessions. And they will be using their AI software to dig into every single listing that's put in the MLS, looking for any kind of wording that says that that mentions commission or compensation or broker compensation. And I promise you, the fine will be hefty.
And this is one of the reasons why role play is so important. Language is really important right now. And if we are doing role play with our colleagues, we're going to begin to get comfortable saying concession instead of commission where it applies. And it's just going to make more sense when you're talking to a client or putting in that new listing.
Yep, you can kind of remove the word commission from your vocabulary as it relates to MLS completely. Just no longer anywhere, no way, shape, form, fashion. It's not going in there. The commission or compensation is between you and your seller. So one other easier way to think of it is you have a buyer's agency agreement with a buyer. That buyer now owes you that money. If within the, so they can write you a check, they can do whatever, but they owe you the money. The seller does not. The buyer owes you that compensation for as long as you provided the services that you agreed to and you have a successful transaction and closing, then that money is coming from the buyer. They can negotiate it with you in the purchase agreement. They can write you a check, or they can increase, the fees that are paid at closing, or they can try to work it into their mortgage, whatever it is. But think of it, if you get in a mindset that the buyer is responsible for it, and get out of our old mindset that, it's always coming from the seller. There's still opportunity for it to come from the seller, either through the concessions or come from the listing brokerage, and paid to you in commissions. But you need to be thinking through this a lot more now and understanding where that path of money, where it's coming from. Okay.
All right,
What's
we've
next?
got, well, Tony's got a good question, but I need to jump up. This is from Mobile. Will one buyer's agreement work for everyone on the team, or does each agent need to be listed on the form if they may have to help the client? I'm assuming we're talking about team leaders and team members here, not team being as part of the Mobile office.
That's a great,
That's
I'm assuming, you're talking about a team leader. I
gotta
would
be
say that you need to do it by licensee.
Yeah.
I wouldn't, so, your team means nothing to the state board, just to be honest, and it really means nothing to an attorney, for safety. And there may be some ruling out there I'm not aware of. So if someone knows of something different, please feel free to, to speak up. I will make this general statement too, guys. I'm learning this just like you are. There's no magical book over here that I get to read or your brokers get to read that, just tells us all the magical answers. I have spent hours and hours and hours watching videos, reading documents, going back through the NAR site, going back through the AAR site. I mean, you're going to have to spend time in doing this, because one, listening to this is, if it's brand new to you, it's not going to stick. I mean, digging in and getting these agreements out, start filling them out, start going through scenarios, start doing this stuff. It's the quickest way to get you up to speed, and so that you're not sitting in front of a buyer or seller and go, I don't know. Now, granted, there may be some scenarios that we've never even talked about, but the basic ones you've got to get familiar with, and you've got to spend the time to get, comfortable with explaining. And again, we've been doing training for months now, and some of it more scenario based, because we knew some of this stuff would be kind of, I mean, the state forms didn't come out until 2.5 weeks ago. I think July 22nd was the date they finally issued them. So we are where we are, and here's what I'll say is, you're not going to stop doing business. We're going to pursue forward, and we're going to continue to do business. We're still offering the same services, the same benefits that we always have. We just have this new little caveat that we've got to kind of get around and understand better, but still deliver the same or better level of service that we always have. That's just where we are. I don't want people to get frustrated and frazzled about it, and shut down. That's the worst thing we can do. We've got to pursue it and get ourselves comfortable and move forward. But I promise you, it's probably not a tenth as hard as what you might make it. And also, a lot of these scenarios that we've even talked about probably will happen 1 out of 500. Others, the ones that we probably more commonly talk about, it's probably going to be 99% of the time what we're dealing with. But we've got to get familiar with all of it. So, okay, what's next
Troy,
question?
Tony, and I think he's right. And it's up on the screen right now. Optional buyers broker compensation. Can we go through this kind of line by line and talk about it one more time?
Sure. Is that what the question is?
It is. He
Yeah.
just wants to get a little bit more clarification on this paragraph.
Okay.
An agent filling in.
All right. So if somebody will turn their mic off, please. Let's see, TA.
Tony has raised his hand.
Tony.
I don't think
Okay. Yeah. I'm sorry.
unmute Tony.
hey, so this is actually Erica. We're in a group up here in the office, but we were asking, what if you are going out of town and you needed another agent in the Bellator office to show somebody for you? Would your buyer agency agreement work in that way, or would you have to have something added to your buyer agency to be able to show that buyer?
I would probably just add it, and if maybe what you do is create a team one that includes, the team lead and these agents, so that when you're signing an agreement, you're signing them with basically all three people. I mean, it's with the brokerage, but specifically, just to keep things, I think, more clear, you might want to do that for the convenience. But I would always say default on the side of caution, and worst case scenario, go have another one if you didn't have that included, where you just had, so in your scenario, Erica, you had your name, and it was just your name on the buyer broker services agreement, and the compensation agreement only had your name, and Bill was going to go show property for you on a weekend, and your name was the only one on it. I'd have Bill sign up completely separate one with them, understanding that it would be under the same terms as, as the one signed on whatever previous date that you had. And I would reference that. There's probably going to be more clarity here, but we know we're not going to double charge them. That might be the only thing that somebody might say is, well, I'm not signing a separate one, with you. And theoretically, Bill could say 0, no compensation owed to me, Bill, but you still owe compensation to Erica. And one other caveat, your agreement, if it's limited, so same scenario, just thought of this. If your buyer broker services agreement, you might, you could put limitations. It might be on one property. And if Bill's going to show new property, then he definitely needs to have a whole new agreement that defines his, properties being shown, or period of time, or whatever it is that or may be conditions with that buyer, to make sure that there is an agreement for compensation that's suitable to you and your team within that agreement. And I know everybody's got a different way they're going to do business, but just keep in mind any limitations you put on there. Time, might be subject to first 5 properties, or a specific address, whatever. If you pursue new avenues and it's not included in that agreement, you don't have protection to be paid, outside of that. So the broader you can leave it, state of Alabama, for 180 days, anything you buy, I'm being compensated. That's your best terms. But the reality is, there's probably going to be some people that say, I'm only willing to do this in, maybe for a short period of time, or more than likely. And what I think is probably the better time for, or the better scenario is, if you've got to make limitations, put it on specific properties and a much longer time frame. Because in that scenario, if they come back to it, you show them a property, and then they come back 3 months later and buy that property, you're still owed compensation. Whereas if you just say, I'm just going to be your agent for a week, well, unless they're paying cash, more than likely they're not going to close within that week period. So just got to think through, if you're putting any limitations on that buyer services agreement that you sign with your buyer, make sure it makes sense. Did that answer the question?
Didn't answer Tony's question, but I think it answered Erica's. I hope.
Erica's question. All right, let's go through the buyer broker compensation.
Yeah.
So what was that?
I was just saying, paragraph 5 is still out there to be gone through.
Seller may, but is not required to. That's your, new little caveat that you're going to hear, for quite a while. Offer compensation to buyer's broker. Such an offer is not required in list property in the MLS, and no offers will be included in the MLS listing. Seller's written authorization is required prior to any offer being made. So B, broker is authorized would be, let's just run a scenario where, for the typical listing that you have today, you've got a 6% listing and you're going to share, you've got authorization to share 3%. And that just makes it simple. So in that scenario, broker, check mark on the first box, is authorized to offer compensation to buyer's broker. If authorized, select one. So we've got two options. Option I, payment will be made by the seller's broker, meaning the listing broker, out of the compensation due to the seller broker under paragraph 4. In paragraph 4, remember, we negotiated a 6% commission. So we've got 6%. At that point in time, in number 4, 6% is all coming to the listing broker. Okay. All of that compensation is coming to us because we have an agreement now, or soon will when they sign it, bilateral agreement between buyer and seller, listing broker and seller, to say this is our compensation. But the seller is giving us authorization to share some of that, check mark number 1 in B, and then I with a portion of that. And then we've got to determine, so that's all that's done. If they say, yep, I'm willing to share, and I'm going to share a portion of that from paragraph 1. Now we got to decide how much are you going to share and to whom. So in C, we're saying same offer of buyer's broker. You pick one, or I. This is number C. In C, I, the same offer to any broker, meaning I'm not differentiating between brokers. I'm going to offer all of them the same compensation, and it's going to be 3%, and you're done. In that, they're saying that you can differentiate between brokers and other things. I would not recommend that. I think it can become cumbersome, and, unless, maybe there's a no service, like whatever, some of the business practices where they come in and, they don't even represent the buyer. They just, give them a purchase agreement or something. I don't know. But, for simplicity's sake, that's basically the scenario we're running right now, and we have been. So that would be it. That's all you'd have to do. If for some reason the seller said, hey, I've heard that, there are some, differences between, buyers being able to have full representation, and if they're only serving as a transaction broker. Well, they're saying that you can offer different amounts of compensation, one to the, a buyer broker that is representing them as exclusively, or if they're serving as a transaction broker, you could pay them a different amount. We can talk for days about that, but hopefully that makes sense. But I probably wouldn't even go down that avenue. It also says, all right, so those are the two scenarios. If you check I and B, you are limited to only checking I or II. And I would say 99.999% of the time, it's going to be I, and the rest of it's not, we don't even have to talk about. But if they're saying, and I think this is where it gets confusing, in B on II, if you're checking the second box, II, payment will be made in addition to the compensation due to seller's broker. So everything that's the same as in I, all that money that's being paid. So let's just say in that scenario, the compensation, the listing agreement is for 3%. And that's all that we're receiving. So payment will be made in addition to compensation due to the seller's broker. So we're saying we're keeping that 3% because that's our fee to list your property. Payment will be made by the seller's broker after the funds are provided by the seller and to seller's broker, meaning in the negotiation of this new contract that we get on a case-by-case basis, we're gonna decide, we'll have a separate agreement. We're gonna decide how much can be offered through compensation to the buyer's broker. That's where the check mark would be 3. So theoretically, if you're picking in B, if you're picking II, your only option is triple I. You would never have any other combination that I can think of. So in the first one, 99% of when you're doing this in offering of compensation to do basically what we've been doing for as long as you've been in the business, it would be I, and then you're writing in the amount on C. And obviously it's got to authorize it. If for some reason they're not offering any offers of compensation to the buyer broker, they check no, and then they come down to, seller's concession. Theoretically, they could offer both. And I said this before, they could be offering concessions within giving concession. Let's just say they signed a 6% listing agreement, and they've authorized us as the listing broker to share 3% of that with a buyer's broker. They could also be authorizing seller concessions. The example I used was they know they've got a roof that's 30 years old and it's way past due, and they know it's going to be $15,000 to replace it, and they offer $15,000, in seller concessions. That theoretically could happen, but again, we can go a million scenarios, but hopefully that makes sense. You have to separate broker compensation, or if you in your head want to say broker compensation or broker commissions, that's negotiated up there. On number 4, we've said this is how much we know we're negotiating with you. And like I said, you're probably going to have to come down here and almost explain, the offering of compensation to other brokers before you can even put something in for the dollar amount, in my opinion. And then once that's decided, then you come down and say, all right, we're going to offer X% to the buyer's broker of this percent. Hopefully that's starting to make sense.
Yeah, Tony, if you've got a specific question on that and you want to unmute and fire away, go ahead. Otherwise, it's probably going to be something that you're going to spend a lot of time in your sales meetings with Miss Annette going through. So I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat.
Wow.
Troy.
Well, that thing kept popping up. I thought we'd have 25 questions. Okay. Well, if anybody wants to click on their mic and ask away, I will go back through this. I'll go back through the slides. And I'm just telling you now, if you're willing to ask questions, I promise you, even if you think, oh God, this is going to sound so dumb, more than likely somebody else or the majority of people on the call would probably benefit from it. So don't feel, like, because if you didn't, or if you ask this question, it's pointless. So I'm happy to answer questions.
Troy, Jeremy had said earlier on that same part about number 6, seller concessions, optional seller concessions, that when he completed that form recently, he didn't check any box. He just typed in TBD by future offer. And so I'm thinking that we need to go ahead and click does not authorize, even if we add that sentence, so that it's clear that we've made that an option to our client.
Yeah. And remember, they can always come back and decide to offer it, and just like anything else, think about this, and here's some of the benefits of, and the reason why I still feel strongly about, for preservation, anyway, of the buyer side commission, and the benefits that come with this is when it enters into this realm, it is in one big ball of concessions that can be negotiated, more accessibly. When it's a compensation being paid from the other broker, that's already an agreement signed. That deal's done. That becomes a non-variable because it's already included in the purchase, in the listing price. No different than the roof, than the front door, than the driveway. Like that's all within that package because we've already got an agreement that says we're going to retain, X% and we are paying out Y% to a buyer broker for a successful transaction with us at an acceptable purchase price. But here again, it's already included, but they still have to get to a purchase price and terms that that both parties agree to. No different. I mean, if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. Here it just becomes a little more convoluted. And remember, it's just because it's concession does not mean that the buyer has to allocate a portion of that to the buyer broker commissions. The buyer broker compensation from those concessions. That doesn't mean they have to. But back to the listing side, they can not authorize it and then come back and within the purchase agreement do it. Just because they say doesn't authorize doesn't mean they're limited to that later on. You're not able to, in that scenario, we just wouldn't be able to, as a listing company, we wouldn't be able to promote that they are offering, seller concessions.
Well, and remember that the legal team at AAR said that if it's not restated in the purchase agreement, never mind what you have in the listing agreement. If it's not restated or stated in the purchase agreement, then it still isn't part of the deal. This is what they're willing to do, but if it's not in the purchase agreement, then it's, whatever.
Yeah, all this is saying, this is the listing agreement. All this is saying is, as the listing company, the seller is authorizing us to say that there is an offer of seller concessions, and if we write in an amount, they may say, I think someone said it earlier, TBD, so like in Mobiles, you're not able to put an amount anyway. It's either offering or not offering. So, let's just say that was the rule for everybody. Well, you have no idea what it is. So there's no question. It's got to be in the purchase agreement. I mean, it's got to be spelled out. This is just saying, hey, yeah, I'll consider it with a good offer. I'll consider, some kind of seller concessions. This does not mean I will pay your buyer broker service fee. That does not mean that at all. It just means that possibly, let's see what kind of offer we got. I could pay closing costs, I could pay repairs, I could pay a lot, but it's all going to be bundled within this optional seller's concession that I'm saying within the list price that I've got, I will authorize either a certain amount or some, but definitely has to be within that purchase agreement no matter what.
Annette, you put a beautiful image in here with lots of colors, but unfortunately I can't enlarge it. I have no idea what it says. So if you want to explain the graphic.
That's just a little graphic that our upstairs group in Mobile did for you guys, just for not for question. Tony has his hand raised. Tony, you want to unmute?
Okay, so we had a question about, sorry, we're the slow group up here, I guess. We have a question about number 4 and number 5. Because you're saying
this is the listing agreement?
Yes, sorry, on the listing agreement. So number 4B, you're telling us to put, let's just say for round number sake, we decide to do 6%, and then we would check B, they're authorizing it, and I would be a payment, and then CI would be a 3% payout. So we're collecting 6% on the listing and paying out 3%. Mm-hmm. Could we not also, and I'm just asking for clarification, could we not also put 4B is, okay, I decide that all my listings I'm going to take at 3.5, and I put 3.5 on 4B is 3.5, and then payout over on 5B, I would check double I, and CI would be 3 or 2.5 or whatever. Could you not split out seller compensation under number 4 and buyer compensation under number 5?
Ask that again. I want to make sure I understand your question.
Okay.
And do the scenario. You just repeat it.
Okay. So how you explained it, and it is correct from how I'm understanding, 4B, we could put, I'm going to list at a 6%. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to do 6%. And then I come over to B and I check, I'm going to authorize
BI, the payment will be made out
Okay.
of my
So
compensation.
when you're saying B though, you're saying B and 5. So we've left
B,
4.
yes, sorry, B5.
Now we're down to 5.
So
Okay, yeah.
have
I just want to make sure.
4B is 6%. They've
Uh-huh.
decided to pay a 6%. And I come over to number 5 and I check B, they're going to authorize, and I, they're going to pay out of my commission.
Mhm.
And I come down to CI and I
Mhm.
say I'm going to pay out 2.5%.
Mhm.
So that means I'm keeping 3.5 of the full 6 and I'm paying out 2.5%.
Mhm.
So that's one scenario.
Mhm.
But my other question is, could you also go back to 4B, because that
Mhm.
is seller's broker compensation? Could I negotiate mine and say, well, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, I charge a 3.5%.
Mhm.
I'm going to, under 4B, put 3.5%. And then I'm going to come over to 5. Hey, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, you have the option to compensate the buyer's agent if you would choose to do so, in which case we would check B, authorize, check B double I as making an additional payment, and then
Mhm.
check CI as, oh, you've decided to pay them 2.5%. You've decided to pay them 2%. You've decided whatever to compensate them with. Could you not split it out? Because that's seller broker compensation on number 4, which is mine,
Yeah.
and number 5 is buyer compensation.
Yeah, no, you could. You're right.
Okay.
You could do it that way.
Okay.
I was trying to keep things as simple as possible,
Okay,
but
I'm
no,
sorry. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
no,
Yes,
you're
the-
right. I
the
mean, it's a
seller
way
can
to do it.
absolutely- Yeah. That is
I've just ran into, when I've gone to listing appointments, I've run into where they are now asking me, well, what is your fee versus what is their fee? I'm running into that where they're wanting it split more. And so I am probably leaning towards, when I do my listing presentation, saying, this is my compensation. And then what would you like to offer in terms of compensation, if anything, to the buyer's agent?
You got to the same place. The only caveat with that is that I don't think it was made for that, but I feel like it still accomplishes the same thing, and it's
Yes.
just the additional compensation. But the reason for that was really to go into, when you don't know it, you can't determine it yet, so we've got to have a separate agreement saying that we'll determine it basically at a later date. But to answer your question, yes, you could do that. And
Okay.
and I know it's like easier on our current listing agreement, the Bellator listing agreement, it splits it out. And so it's easy.
Right.
It's, my fee is X. What do you want us to pay, the buyer broker? You determine it. So
Yeah.
but you could even, go back to 4, Amanda. I know she's probably tired, and Amanda, if you want to give me control, that way you can do other things. I'm happy to, I just hit take control. Request. I just requested it from you. So, but you could, give it to me. How long I remember what I was saying. You could, in the listing agreement, you can have, God, what was I saying? We're just talking about the break, the split between it. And in this compensation agreement, I don't know. I was gonna make some random point, but it's probably not important. But to answer your question, yeah, you can do what you've asked. Yeah, you can do. Oh, I know what I was gonna say. In number 4, you could put total. So on number 4, you click. Can you see my cursor?
No, it's still not in your control.
No, it's, oh,
You've got to make sure you have it pulled up on your screen.
I do.
We see a cursor moving. I don't know if it's yours.
That's Amanda's.
It's still Amanda moving.
I just sent you request. Anyway, it's not a big deal. So to answer your question, not to confuse things more, but to break it out, and I think it's maybe a little safer, is you on 4, seller agrees to pay seller's broker, 6%, and then under that, you could just write it in, compensation to be split, Bellator, 3% or 3.5, buyer broker 2.5. If you wanted to do it there, just as it's kind of overkill. and I wouldn't even check the other box. I would just put it as kind of like explanation. But anyway, but I get it. I mean, I know what you're saying, and I know why you're saying it. It's more of the aesthetics of showing them that I'm not retaining 100% of this. I'm paying out a portion of it and having it all in one spot. But then you'd be repeating that at the bottom. So what else?
There's a question, and it is, would number 6, which is the seller concessions, negate the buyer broker commission above in 5 if not stated?
What's that?
And I'm
If not restated.
Oh, I'm sorry. So,
So
would number 6, optional seller concessions, negate the buyer broker commission above in paragraph 5 if not restated in?
Nope.
I wouldn't.
That's commission.
Completely separate.
Compensation is commission. Concession, completely different. That agreement, optional broker compensation, is the agreement that the listing broker has with the seller. Remember, this is the listing agreement. So we're saying, Mr. Seller, we've got an agreement with you for listing your property. That offer of the agreement we have is for listing your property. Our fee is X for doing that. Do you or do you not want to offer buyer broker compensation? If you want to, how much of our, if it's enough, over anything above our fee for listing would be negated here. Part of this is you're still putting all this in one basket. You've got to separate it. You've got to separate the contract with the listing broker and the compensation being paid through the listing broker, which is the option 2 of the little chart. That's up there. When you get into concessions, that's a whole different ball game. Now you're saying whatever was between 4 and 5, however that was, finalized, that's one agreement. Now we've got optional concessions. Do not automatically think that just because offer of seller concessions is being offered, that means buyer brokers are getting paid, because it doesn't. It can, and it probably in most cases will, but it's not a guarantee of even being paid. And then beyond that, to Annette's point, you've also got to go back and you've got to negotiate that within the terms of the purchase agreement. But this is just saying that they will. Now, some will say in there, okay, yep, let's offer, 3%. And then if there's additional concessions, maybe we can come back and we may have to renegotiate that. But that's the reason that bottom 2 is like, we don't know what it would be yet. We can offer, we don't know what we want to offer because I want to cap it at a certain amount as a seller. And I don't want to give it all to the, I don't want to pay Y% to a buyer broker or offer that if maybe their services weren't worth it and maybe they're only charging 2%. I want to possibly save that. That could be a scenario. So why do I want to put that out there first? Let them tell me how much they're wanting, and I'll allocate it to the buyer, and then the buyer can decide how he spends their money. That's going to happen. Does that make sense?
It did for that question. She gave thumbs up.
Okay.
All right. So Tony has raised his hand twice, and both times we said, Tony, unmute and ask your question. And I heard Erica instead. So either Tony's raising his hand for Erica or Tony's got a question that keeps getting skipped. So Tony, last chance.
I think it's the Tony Erica group.
Okay.
No, we're good to go. Thank you.
Okay. Just checking. I didn't know Erica did the talking for you, but if you're going to nominate someone to speak for you, Erica would be a good one. So
that's it?
I think that's it.
I don't know if they're still listening in the hub, but if you are, welcome to Wayne Haney and Charlotte Taylor and Kim Sherrill, who are guests with us today.
Oh, great.
Awesome. Welcome.
Awesome. Glad they're on. All right. Well, looks like Amy Norris, or maybe she's
all good.
Okay. All right. Well, Man,
Troy wants to stay on till 1, guys. Give him more. I'm heading to lunch, but
I was
thanks,
really
everybody.
hoping for an hour and a half, but I'm seeing 3 hours and 29 minutes, but I know we didn't stay.
We
Well,
started recording long before the
Long
meeting
before.
started. So
I should have made mention, now that we're done, that this was, recorded, so be glad to post this and, let y'all rewatch it and tell me all the mistakes I made and all that kind of stuff. Well, how many people did we get up to? I'm just curious.
it was
At one
tough to
point-
tell. I only saw like about 40, but I mean, there's so many people watching in groups.
Right,
The
yeah,
last-
now, I know
the
the
last-
groups.
The last number I saw was 48, but there were multiple groups of people.
Yeah, yeah, I know the offices each did groups, so it's, so we probably had, I mean, I would think well over 100 people. When you factor in, 4 or 5 of those were at least 15 to 20. Cool. All right. Well, thank y'all. Appreciate the input. If, I'm sure what we can do is probably post this and then from there, maybe start trying to do some, additional questions, and then we'll have, we'll plan on having more of these. I'll get with the brokers on Friday. You have specific questions or whatever, get it to them, and then we'll plan the next one. Might just maybe just plan it for the, a separate week. I don't want to take away from your individual meetings at your offices. But we may try to do this for a couple more weeks, just on a set schedule, like every Wednesday at 2:00 or something. But anyway, we'll come up with that and talk about it and post that and go from there. Y'all have a great rest of your Tuesday.
You too. Thank you.
Appreciate you participating.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
No, it's in the break room or the whatever.